Hey y'all, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that connects you with the best movies to stream. And today we're going to be talking about the most controversial movies you can currently catch on Netflix. So this is going to be a mixed list. We've got 18 movies that made the official ranked list, plus 2 honorable mentions that I'll get to later in the video. This video is sponsored by the Beard Club, and I'll be telling you more about them later in the video, but for now, let's go ahead and get started with my number 18 pick, which is the weakest recommendation on this list. It's titled White Girl. Now, this movie has a lot in common with the 1995 movie Kids. That movie was rated NC-17, featured a lot of graphic sequences, and it's mostly young people in New York City doing things you would be horrified to find your children doing. White Girl, though, follows a young woman who moves into an apartment in New York and falls in love with a local drug dealer, only to just spiral completely out of control. This is a cocaine-fueled movie. It features multiple graphic sex scenes. Morgan Saylor is the lead here. You might recognize her from Homeland, where she also played a teenager that was up to no good. This can be a very disturbing and upsetting movie that ultimately doesn't quite get off the ground. It gets close, it goes into some crazy directions, and it feels like it never quite makes the point that it wants to make, and if it does, it falls a little bit flat, which is why it's at the back of this list. But in terms of graphic material, this is one of the more intense movies on this list. My next pick is the only documentary to make this list, and it was just recently added to Netflix, Running with the Devil.
Before he was murdered, Fall complained to authorities about his neighbor, software security pioneer John McAfee.
This follows the criminal activities of software developer John McAfee. He's most famous for developing McAfee Cybersecurity, a brand you're probably familiar with, but he's maybe now more famous for being an absolute wild man. This documentary does cover his career a little bit just to get you set up, but it's mostly about him on the run from the law for years. While he was doing that, there were a couple of documentarians from Vice following him that managed to get some really just cruddy footage out of all of this, but this guy was up to some shit. This is movie level stuff in a documentary. This is an insane character who is far from lovable. He is not a character you're going to get too attached to, but the actual events on camera in this are absolutely wild. They look like something out of a Hollywood movie, yet this all really happened, and it happened fairly recently. Okay, now I do want to preface my number 16 pick on this list by saying that a lot of people don't like it. It is an homage to one of the most disturbing movies ever made, though, Cannibal Holocaust. This, though, is The Green Inferno, directed by Eli Roth. Now, it's absolutely worth noting that Eli Roth has a very unique style, and it's on full display in The Green Inferno. There's sort of a weird tone with Eli Roth movies, and this movie has it in spades. I do find a lot of people do not enjoy it. You're very aware that you're watching a movie, some of the performances are weak, and the graphic nature of The Green Inferno is really just an attempt to disgust the audience as much as possible. However, the movie he's referencing here, Cannibal Holocaust, is much, much worse. The Green Inferno is actually somewhat consumable compared to Cannibal Holocaust, but you do have to kind of enjoy B-level horror movies. If you don't, this one's gonna seem a little too weird and not quite like a complete movie, but if you do, The Green Inferno's got a lot of great little gems in there that are absolutely fun to watch, even though the rest of the movie is absolutely horrifying. Okay, my number 15 pick on this list stars Brad Pitt and is based on a major controversy involving Barack Obama. It's titled War Machine. In this movie, Brad Pitt plays Glenn McMahon, a general tasked with heading up the massive rebuilding operation in Afghanistan. Beyond Brad Pitt, this movie has a fantastic cast, but his performance is excellent. It's very much a Coen Brothers type of a performance, and the movie itself has quite a bit of humor in it, but it is a little bit dry as well. This is based on actual events, and the movie itself is not solely about the controversy, but ultimately a Rolling Stone writer was with him and some of his men Afghanistan, as they were criticizing the Obama administration, the administration in charge at the time that this happened. A story was written about it, and all hell broke loose again, though. That's not all this movie is about, and even though the US is now out of Afghanistan, this is still an interesting look at what the US was trying to do in that country, for better or for worse. Now, my next pick is based on the writings of Stephen King, who has obviously had many controversial projects throughout his career, Gerald's Game just being another one to add to the list. This was actually directed by Mike Flanagan, who has gone on to do a whole bunch of horror series for Netflix: The Haunting of Hill House, Bly Manor, and Midnight Mass. Gerald's Game, though, was a wildly successful Netflix original movie. Not only is it successful at retelling the Stephen King story, but it's much more in-depth than a lot of Netflix originals tend to be. This movie feels much more complete. However, there is a very disturbing thing that happens in this movie that is ultimately sort of the fulcrum that the entire story hinges on. I'm not going to spoil it in this video. And not only is that rough stuff, but the movie itself does deal with several controversial themes, and it does all of that beautifully. Speaking of beautiful things, though, it's high time I told you how I keep this beard so damn sharp looking, and it's by using today's sponsor, the Beard Club. Now, the Beard Club has everything you're going to need to keep your beard looking healthy and well maintained, but the chief one is gotta be this bad boy right here. This is the PT45 trimmer, and it is far and away the best trimmer I have ever owned, and I have had several in my life. I'll be honest, I was skeptical at first, but this thing absolutely slides like butter, and it comes with a bunch of different guards, which is what you need if you want to get a nice straight taper like that. I was so used to having to use scissors and take forever. This thing doesn't pull, it gets every hair. It's actually quite amazing. And if you've ever used beard oil, I'll be honest, I've never seen the point. It seems like a waste of time. It doesn't do much for me. The Beard Club's beard oil, I've literally had to practice not stroking my beard because it makes it feel so nice. Ladies, seriously, if your man has a beard, get him some of these products. You will want to run your fingers through his beard. And as I said, they've got tons of products, including the grooming kit, which comes with that PT45 trimmer, but they've even got a growth kit, which comes with the growth oil and several other things. So if you've got a patchy beard, they have solutions for that too. And not only that, but my viewers are gonna save 20% off when they go to beardclub.com/Van Dam, that's VANDAM, and use the code Van Dam, VANDAM. Again, you're gonna get 20% off when you do that. And not only do they have literally everything you could possibly need for your beard, but every product I've used has been top quality stuff. Even the beard brush is the biggest, nicest, softest one I own, and I have one in almost every room in the house. Again, go to the link in the description to get that discount, or just type in beardclub.com/VANDAM and use that code Van Dam to get that 20% discount. But speaking of fantastic stuff, let's move on with the rest of the movies on this list. Okay, my next pick on this list is a fantastic little indie movie that takes place in the 1970s and is based on one of the most disturbing things to ever happen on live news. Christine stars Rebecca Hall as Christine Chubbuck, a 1970s TV reporter in Florida who was struggling with severe depression and ultimately took her own life with a revolver on live television. Yes, I spoiled the ending to this movie, but it's a fairly well-known story, and the real reason to watch this movie is the journey leading up to it. So this movie is not just about an awful event, it really is about depression, how it used to be treated, or rather untreated, in the 1970s, and the repercussions of that. Rebecca Hall does an amazing job in this movie. I've always been a fan of hers ever since I saw her in The Town, but this is one of the strongest performances she's ever really been asked to give, and she really brings the heat with it as well. It's incredibly convincing. Obviously, it's a downer of a movie, but again, it's incredibly well crafted. But we'll go from that downer of a movie to one of the funniest movies on this list that still managed to have quite a bit of controversy around it. This is The End. Now, outside of Pineapple Express and Superbad, this is one of my favorite movies that this crew came together to do. I find it absolutely hilarious, even if this ultimately plays out like one long sketch. You've got a bunch of great comedy actors in this doing incredible work. The chief one for me, though, is Danny McBride. I absolutely love his character in this movie and find every moment he has to be some of the best in a movie full of really silly but fun moments. Now, not only does this ultimately revolve around an apocalyptic event, but it's also technically the rapture, so there's some religious stuff in here that pissed some people off. But not only that, there's a bunch of cameos in here as well, some that really push boundaries, including one with Emma Watson. Reportedly, she was not happy on set with one of the jokes she was involved in and left the set of this movie. However, the joke still makes it into the final movie. It is really funny, and so is the rest of the movie. Again, second to Pineapple Express and Superbad, I find this to be one of the funnier movies this crew ever put together. Now, speaking of funny crews, one of the more underrated movies I think Monty Python ever put out was also one of their most controversial, The Life of Brian. Now, this follows the life of a young man named Brian who is essentially Christ for the sake of the story, and he wants nothing to do with being chosen. And the movie itself pokes a lot of fun, not at just Christianity, but Judaism and organized religion as a whole. More specifically, the origins of the stories, and it is good fun. It's not only having fun at the expense of religiously minded people, it's having a lot of fun at the expense of how we used to live in the world. You know, torture, stoning people, that type of stuff. Monty Python, as always, has the most sort of clever twist on those things, and it works really well in The Life of Brian. It didn't prevent people from being mad about this movie when it came out, but if you watch it today, most of the humor is fairly lighthearted by today's standards. All right, now War Machine was sort of this lighter-hearted movie about the war in Afghanistan. My next pick, though, was a highly controversial movie when it was released because of the way it depicted torture.
I'm not your friend. I'm not gonna help you. I'm gonna break you. Any questions?
Zero Dark 30 is ultimately the story of how Osama bin Laden was tracked down and killed, yet it does depict US intelligence agents torturing people in really horrific ways, and it's all based on reality, real tactics that were used at this time. This is stuff that is supposedly not done anymore, yet you do get to kind of see it in full force in Zero Dark 30, and it's basically the way the movie opens up. There was tons of controversy around this back when this movie released, people that refused to see it, people that felt like it shouldn't be depicted in movies. You name it, people were mad about it, but this is directed by Kathryn Bigelow, who had just previously won an Academy Award for The Hurt Locker, a movie that I do think story-wise is better than Zero Dark 30, but Bigelow also did Point Break and a bunch of really fantastic movies, and Zero Dark 30 is another one of hers that is great, but it too is long and can be pretty exhausting because of how intense it ultimately is. Another exhaustingly intense movie stars Charlize Theron as one of, if not the first, female serial killer ever put to death in the US. Charlize Theron plays a Daytona Beach prostitute who turns into a serial killer and also has kind of a weirdly romantic relationship with Christina Ricci's character. They are both fantastic in this. In fact, Charlize Theron won an Academy Award for her portrayal of this character. And I will admit, there is quite a bit of makeup doing a lot of the heavy lifting for her, but she does do a fantastic job. This, though, is an incredibly disturbing movie. Not only were her actions disturbing, but the life she led up to becoming a serial killer is particularly disturbing. Quite a bit of sexual assault in this movie. They try to show you why she became this person, and it's obviously rough stuff, but ultimately this is a solid movie. Even if it's kind of hard to watch, it's well made, and there's a reason it won so many awards back when it was released. Okay, I know some of you were wondering, is it going to make the list? And yes, the new Netflix original movie about Marilyn Monroe, titled Blonde, comes in at number 8. Now, it comes in at number 8 not because of how controversial it has been. It's because I think that this is actually a pretty excellent movie, yet I know it has made a lot of people very upset. So this movie is kind of a post-Harvey Weinstein evaluation of how women were treated, and not just women, but famous women were treated a very particular way. Now, the movie does touch on the treatment of women outside of that a little bit, but it does show how the Hollywood machine literally could grind someone up and spit them out. That is what Blonde, I think, is really about. And the journey is kind of a beautiful one. Even the scenes with her insane mother, which was a really heartbreaking thing to see on film, they're shot beautifully. I mean, the movie itself, you can pause at almost any frame and it's stunning. It is 3 hours, it is exhausting, it is extremely sexually graphic, which I think is what put a lot of people off, especially the generation that grew up loving Marilyn Monroe. I was born in 1984. I've got no real cultural tie to Marilyn Monroe, so that didn't affect me. And a lot of the stuff shown was things that are kind of known already, yet they're so vivid in Blonde. Not only did that upset people, but I think the 3 hour runtime with the downer nature of her life story is pretty exhausting. But if you've been the least bit curious about it, there are definitely worse ways to spend 3 hours than seeing Ana de Armas play Marilyn Monroe in an NC-17 movie. Okay, my next pick, believe it or not, is the only feature film directed by Jason Bateman, who is a killer director. Not only did he direct some of Ozark, but every project this guy produces is pure magic, and the only comedy he directed was wildly underappreciated when it was released. Bad Words follows a man who has figured out a loophole allowing him to enter children's spelling bees. Jason Bateman plays a total dirtbag in this movie, and it is a absolute joy to watch him do it. He is being really mean and awful to kids, but if you just remember that it's Jason Bateman and he directed it, this is an absolute riot of a movie that is not only funny, it ultimately makes a really interesting point and goes in a direction I did not see coming. Movies always earn big points for that for me, but I have recently rewatched Bad Words, and it is so much better than I remember it being back when it was released. I feel like my next pick would still be controversial today, but for different reasons than it was back in '93 when it was released. I'm talking about the Hughes brothers' first feature film, Menace to Society. So the story here is nothing too special. It's something you've seen before. You've got this young street hustler who's trying to break free from the ghetto. He's trying to overcome all the temptations and pitfalls. You could come up with 10 movies that follow the same plot line, but what the Hughes brothers were going for with this movie was to create a black Goodfellas. This came out just a few years after Goodfellas, which is largely considered one of the greatest movies ever made, not just by me, but by many, many filmmakers, the Hughes brothers being in that group, and they succeeded. And it's worth noting it was largely controversial for some of the actions that the criminal characters in this movie take. They hit home, they're very realistic, and very disturbing to people, especially 30 years ago when this was released. This was an edgy movie, less so today, but at the same time, you also don't see a whole lot of movies like this being made today. Okay, my next pick was controversial for many reasons. When the first trailer released, it was way too sexy, and still to this day is maybe the sexiest movie trailer ever released. There was tons of anticipation for this movie before it was released, and not only was it NC-17 and extremely sexually graphic, most people hated it when it came out in theaters. I'm talking about Stanley Kubrick's final film, Eyes Wide Shut. Now, interestingly enough, this is a movie that people like more today by far than they did back when this was released, and I think it's because there are so many mysteries hidden inside this movie. Most of them went right over people's head when they saw this in the theater, and for good reason. There's a lot of sex in this movie, a lot of graphic sex. Some of it's actually kind of hot, some of it is not. That is all too distracting and to the story at core. Multiple viewings, though, reveal a lot of interesting mysteries in Eyes Wide Shut. However, you do have to be interested in that. You have to want to pursue what this movie is ultimately about. I do not have time to go into those details here in this video, but not only does this have a lot of incredibly interesting mysteries to solve, it's also very well produced. I mean, it is Kubrick. Obviously, the performances are great, but it's just got a bizarre tone that could only come from someone like Stanley Kubrick obsessing over this movie for years the way that he did. Now we'll jump to my number 4 pick, which is another Stanley Kubrick classic, A Clockwork Orange. Now this was not only a controversial movie when it was released, but the book that it's based on was highly controversial when it was released. This takes place in a near future where crime and sin have essentially run amok. Society has really gone down the tubes and continued to get worse and worse. And the story follows a group of young roustabouts, we'll call them, who are up to some horrific activities in their leisure time. Seriously though, their actions in this movie are worse than anything else depicted on any of the other movies on this particular list, and there's some rough stuff on this list. But again, it's Stanley Kubrick. Not only does everything look absolutely incredible in this movie, but it's got a tone you're only going to get from Stanley Kubrick, and A Clockwork Orange is glued together really well in a way that allows all the things to come through crystal clear, and the point that you're left with at the end of A Clockwork Orange is much more clear than anything you can glean from a first viewing of Eyes Wide Shut. Alright, now it's time for my number 3 pick, which was written, not directed, but written by Quentin Tarantino, and then we'll do some honorable mentions before talking about my top 2. But Natural Born Killers is a script Tarantino wrote and sold before he began directing movies. However, even though this was directed by Oliver Stone, there are a lot of Quentin Tarantino touches. Strange costume designs, interesting vibes, almost in a way where you can tell that it's a movie set. Things look a little bit fake at times where they use different backgrounds. All stuff you would go on to see in Tarantino movies. It's present in this Oliver Stone sort of acid-fueled nightmare of a movie. So I guess my point is the way it's written and the dialogue all feels very Tarantino. The way it's chopped up and edited feels absolutely bonkers. It doesn't even feel like Oliver Stone, but still, there are touches of Tarantino in there. And even though this came out after he started directing movies, again, this was written before he officially became a director. So it's one of the cooler movies in his filmography. Because it's not quite his, I would have loved to have seen what he could have done with this movie. However, this crazy fast-paced style that Oliver Stone implemented is also absolutely fantastic. Fair warning though, this movie has some incredibly disturbing moments in it, more so than A Clockwork Orange, which is one of the reasons this ranks so high, but it's also just kind of a wonderfully vicious movie. Alright, honorable mentions. My first one goes to something that's not a movie, which is why it's an honorable mention, but Surviving R. Kelly is currently included with Netflix, and man, is this a wild docu-series. Typically, things like this just involve some hearsay, some interviews. This, though, chronicles not only his career, but how he began to groom underage girls, starting with Aaliyah. Stuff I think a lot of people know about, but they go into the nitty-gritty with this docu-series. Obviously, it's all incredibly upsetting. This was released, I believe, before he was put behind bars. He's in prison now. You can look up videos of him online singing to the inmates, but this docuseries covers the reasons why R. Kelly is going to be behind bars for an incredibly long time. And then the other honorable mention I don't recommend because I haven't seen it, but I have to mention the most controversial movie ever released on Netflix, Cuties. So the reason it doesn't make the list is because I don't care to watch this movie, even if there wasn't any controversy. It's a movie about young girls dancing. It's obviously not made for me, but apparently some of the dancing is over the top and very inappropriate. That doesn't bother me nearly as much as Netflix using this as the poster. This to me seems like they were trying to attract the wrong type of audience for this movie, which is incredibly disturbing and deservedly controversial. I mean, a lot of people canceled their Netflix subscriptions over this. For me, Continuing to be a Netflix subscriber and not watching things like Cuties tells the algorithm to stop producing stuff like this. Okay, my top 2 picks on this list are easily 2 of the absolute best movies currently included with Netflix. My number 2 pick being Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights. So this one's controversial for obvious reasons. It is about the porn industry in the 70s. They actually transition into 1980 in the movie, and it feels like a 70s and 80s movie. Not only is there a killer soundtrack, tons of nudity and sex, but the costumes are killer, the performances are amazing. This movie put Paul Thomas Anderson on the map, and he has stayed there ever since. This is one of the last truly great Burt Reynolds performances and one of the first really great Mark Wahlberg performances. You've also got an amazing one from Julianne Moore in this movie. And while some of the scenes are a little cliche now, they weren't really when this movie was released. And what's so great about Boogie Nights is it does kind of the Goodfellas thing where everything is fun and wild and a party for the first half, and then people start to get what they deserve. They've not quite been living right, and I don't just mean by doing porn, by doing everything else that they're doing in their lives, and they have to begin to pay for those things, and that's ultimately what the movie depicts, and it does so with a bunch of different characters in these really fantastic ways. It is a total gem of a movie. If you've never watched it because you don't care to watch a movie about the porn industry, I'm telling you, this is an absolute killer flick. Now, my number 1 pick is one of the most killer flicks of all time, David Fincher's Seven. So this was released in 1995, over a quarter of a century ago, and it is still to this day one of the darkest, grimmest movies of its kind. Not only that, but it too put David Fincher on the map. He has stayed there ever since, and you've got some amazing actors at work here. Denzel Washington famously turned this movie down because it was too dark, a decision he would later admit to regretting because of how good the movie actually was. And when it was released, its connections to Christianity, particularly the 7 deadly sins, was rebuked by people in the public, not only because they thought it was too dark, but because they thought it made light of the 7 deadly sins, which it does not. It's got a very interesting take on it, and this movie does not look 25 years old. It looks like it was just released yesterday. The cinematography in this movie, as dark and grim as it is, it's absolutely fantastic. And then I'll say most twist endings are really only good for one watch. Once you know what's happening, they're not that good anymore. Seven is a rare exception. The end of this movie is just as exciting and nail-biting to watch the 20th time as it was the first time. I absolutely love Seven. If it's been a while since you've seen it, be sure to check it out on Netflix before it's gone. On that note, if you're still watching the video, definitely click that subscribe button and the little bell icon. That way you get notified about the movies before they're gone. But I will keep making these videos as long as y'all keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Netflix list, and you will see me on the next one.